February 22nd, 2026. Most of Mexico is still asleep when the first reports start flooding in. But within the hour, the country is wide awake, and it is terrified. Highways across Jalisco, Michoacan, Guanajuato, and Veracruz are transformed overnight into walls of fire. Tractor trailers jackknifed and torched, their burning steel carcasses sealing off major routes as if someone had flipped a switch. In Guadalajara, Mexico's second largest city, a sprawling metropolis of 5 million people, streets that should be alive with morning traffic are eerily empty, except for the acrid black smoke rising from 3 different shopping centers set ablaze simultaneously. At the international airport in Guadalajara, panicked passengers scramble with luggage as airport security locks down departures. Flights are canceled. Runways go dark. In a maximum security prison in Puerto Vallarta, guards find themselves suddenly outnumbered. A coordinated assault from both inside and outside the walls overwhelms the facility. Inmates pour into the streets, and in cities as far apart as Tijuana and Cancun, cities that share almost nothing except a flag, the same thing is happening. Roadblocks, fire, chaos. This is not a revolution. This is not a coup. This is not even a coordinated military offensive. This is a funeral, because somewhere in the cold mountains of Jalisco, the man who made all of this possible, the man who had spent decades constructing the most powerful, most militarized, most feared criminal empire in the history of the Western Hemisphere, has just drawn his final breath. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known to the world as El Mencho, leader of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generation, the CJNG, the most wanted drug lord on the planet. A man the United States government had spent 15 years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to find. He is dead, and the world is about to feel it. To understand why the death of one man could bring an entire country to its knees, you have to understand who that man actually was. Not the legend, not the myth, the reality. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born in 1966 in Michoacan, specifically in the municipality of La Hawaiana, one of those small, sun-baked towns along the Pacific coast where poverty is not a condition but a birthright. He grew up in a world where the options were limited and the horizon was short. Like so many young men from that region and that area, the path that offered the most immediate escape from that poverty was also the most dangerous one. But what made El Mencho different from the beginning, and this is crucial, was not his appetite for violence. It was his discipline, his silence, his ability to become invisible. Most of the great drug lords of his generation were men who craved power and its symbols. El Chapo built tunnels and threw lavish parties. Pablo Escobar had his zoo, his private jets, his political ambitions. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to be feared in a way that required recognition. El Mencho wanted none of that. He understood something that those men never fully grasped. The safest position is the one nobody knows you're occupying. In the late 1980s, as a teenager, El Mencho crossed the border into California. He was young, ambitious, and without a safety net. He ended up in San Francisco, and like many undocumented migrants with limited options, he found work in the drug trade, specifically trafficking heroin. It didn't take long for American law enforcement to catch up with him. He was arrested, convicted, and served several years in a U.S. federal prison before being deported back to Mexico in the early 1990s. What happened next is one of the most staggering paradoxes in Mexican law enforcement history. After being deported, El Mencho, a convicted drug trafficker, was hired as a police officer in Jalisco. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who would go on to become the most powerful drug lord in the world, whose cartel would murder federal judges, shoot down military helicopters with rocket launchers, and flood the United States with enough fentanyl to kill a generation. That man once wore a badge. He drove a patrol car. He answered calls. He was at least nominally on the side of the law. Nobody knows exactly what happened during those years, how long he stayed on the force, how deeply he was already connected to criminal networks while wearing a uniform. What we do know is that by the late 1990s and early 2000s, El Mencho had fully crossed over. He began working under the Millennial Cartel, learning the trade at a higher level. He absorbed everything: supply chains, bribery structures, violence as a management tool, territorial control. He was an exceptional student, but it was the collapse of the Millennial Cartel, fractured by internal conflict and pressure from rival organizations, that gave El Mencho his real opportunity. In 2009 or 2010, depending on whose account you believe, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes formally established the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. The CJNG was not going to be like the organizations that came before it. Most criminal organizations rose slowly. They build territory piece by piece, bribe official by official, corridor by corridor. They are careful, methodical, patient. The CJNG was none of those things. From the moment it was established, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación expanded at a pace that shocked even the most seasoned analysts of Mexican organized crime. Within 4 years of its founding, it had established a presence in more than half of Mexico's 31 states. By 2015, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration was calling it one of the 5 most dangerous criminal organizations in the world. By 2020, many analysts considered it the most powerful cartel on earth, having surpassed even the Sinaloa cartel in terms of geographic reach and military capability. How did this happen so fast? 3 reasons, and all 3 of them trace back directly to El Mencho's personal philosophy. The first reason was product. El Mencho made an early and extremely prescient bet on synthetic drugs, specifically methamphetamine and later fentanyl. While other cartels were still deeply invested in cocaine and marijuana products that required agricultural supply chains, specific geography, and complex international relationships, El Mencho understood that the future of the drug trade was synthetic. Fentanyl could be manufactured in a laboratory from precursor chemicals sourced from China. It was 50 times more potent than heroin, 100 times cheaper to produce per dose, and almost impossible to detect in small quantities at border crossings. 1 kilogram of fentanyl could produce hundreds of thousands of lethal doses. The profit margins were obscene. By flooding American cities with fentanyl, the CJNG didn't just enter the U.S. drug market, it fundamentally rewrote it. The D later estimated that El Mencho's cartel was responsible for the majority of fentanyl entering the United States. The synthetic opioid epidemic that killed over 100,000 Americans per year. That wasn't an accident of chemistry or policy. It was in very large part the deliberate business strategy of one man sitting in the mountains of Jalisco. The second reason was military capability. The CJNG did something no cartel had ever done before at scale. It built a paramilitary army. Not a gang, not a collection of hired killers. An actual army with structure, ranks, training, and weapons that belonged on a battlefield, not a street corner. El Mencho's forces operated armored vehicles reinforced with steel plating, commonly called monstruos, monsters that would roll through towns like military convoys. They used .50 caliber machine guns, grenade launchers, rocket-propelled grenades, and improvised explosive devices. They acquired military-grade drones and modified them to carry and drop explosive payloads over enemy territory on multiple occasions over government positions. In 2015, when the Mexican government attempted a major operation to capture El Mencho, CJNG forces shot down a military helicopter with a rocket launcher, killing the federal police officers aboard. The sheer audacity of that act sent a message that reverberated through every government office in Mexico City. This was no longer a law enforcement problem. This was a national security crisis. The third reason was political penetration. El Mencho invested in corruption the way a venture capitalist invests in startups. Broadly, strategically, and with a long-term horizon. Mayors, police chiefs, army commanders, judges, prosecutors, the CJNG's corruption network was not limited to the obvious targets. It went deep. It went sideways. It went upward. Officials who could not be bought were threatened. Officials who refused to be threatened were killed. And not just the officials themselves, their families, their colleagues, their neighbors. The message was simple: you were never outside our reach. This created something more dangerous than a criminal organization. It created a parallel state, a shadow government that in significant portions of Mexican territory exercised more real authority than the elected one. And at the center of all of it, invisible, deliberate, never photographed by choice, and rarely by accident, was El Mencho. The manhunt to find him would become one of the longest, most expensive, and most dangerous law enforcement operations in the history of the Americas. The United States government placed a $15 million bounty on El Mencho's head. To put that in perspective, the bounty on Osama bin Laden was $25 million. The bounty on El Chapo, at the height of his notoriety, was $5 million. $15 million for El Mencho was an extraordinary public acknowledgement of how seriously Washington viewed this man, not just as a criminal, but as a direct threat to American national security. The D did entire task forces to find him. The CIA shared intelligence. The NSA provided signals intelligence, intercepting communications, tracking phone numbers, mapping the digital footprint of an organization that was increasingly careful about its electronic hygiene. The U.S. Treasury Department designated dozens of CJNG associates, freezing assets and cutting off financial channels. Department of Justice indictments named El Mencho specifically, building a legal case that was ready and waiting the moment he could be extradited. And yet for 15 years he remained a ghost. Part of the difficulty was structural. El Mencho had learned from the mistakes of his predecessors with almost academic rigor. El Chapo had been undone repeatedly by his own vanity, his love of women, his desire for recognition, his willingness to communicate via electronic channels that could be intercepted. El Mencho had none of these weaknesses in the traditional sense. He rotated safe houses constantly. He reportedly used human couriers rather than digital communications for his most sensitive instructions. He avoided large gatherings. He did not hold court. He did not throw parties. He was reportedly sick for significant periods, suffering from a serious kidney condition that required medical treatment, and even these vulnerabilities were managed with extraordinary operational security, with trusted medical personnel brought to him rather than him traveling to hospitals. He was also protected by something more fundamental than tradecraft: geography. The mountains of Jalisco, Michoacan, and the surrounding states provided terrain that was not just difficult, but strategically hostile to outside forces. Narrow mountain roads, dense forest, communities where loyalty to the cartel was maintained through a combination of economic dependency and fear. Attempting a ground operation in that terrain without precise intelligence wasn't just difficult, it was suicidal. For years, tips came in and led nowhere. Raids found empty safe houses, still warm. Informants provided intelligence that was accurate, but always just slightly too late. The net kept closing and kept coming up empty. What finally broke the case open was not a technological breakthrough or a high-level defection. It was something far more human and far more inevitable. It was love. Mexican intelligence, working in close coordination with American federal agencies, had for some time been monitoring the movements of individuals connected to El Mencho's inner circle. Not his lieutenants. Those were obvious targets and obvious risks, but the people around the people, family members, associates, companions. At some point in the months before February 2026, surveillance teams began tracking the movements of a woman believed to be in a romantic relationship with El Mencho, or at least in close personal contact with him. The details of exactly how this surveillance was established and maintained have not been fully disclosed and may never be. What we know is the outcome. The intelligence services identified a pattern, a scheduled gathering, a location, an isolated ranch set deep in the mountains of the Talpa de Ane region in eastern Jalisco, a rugged, remote area far from major population centers, surrounded by pine forests and accessible only by narrow mountain tracks. To outsiders, it would look like nothing. A working ranch, animals, a few buildings, the kind of place you'd pass on a mountain road and not remember. To intelligence analysts who had been chasing El Mencho for years, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. The operation that followed was not improvised. For days before the strike, Special Forces units were pre-positioned in the region without broadcasting their presence. The perimeter was studied. Entry and exit routes were mapped. Contingencies were planned for multiple scenarios, including the one that nobody wanted to admit was likely, that El Mencho's personal guard would fight to the death rather than surrender. In the early hours of Sunday, February 22, 2026, the trap was sprung. Helicopter gunships approached from multiple vectors simultaneously, using darkness and mountain terrain to mask their approach for as long as possible. Ground forces, a combined unit of Mexican Special Operations troops, federal military infantry, and intelligence officers, closed the perimeter on all sides. What happened next was not a raid. It was a battle. El Mencho's personal security detail, an elite force of the CJNG's best-trained fighters, armed with heavy weapons and prepared for exactly this kind of scenario, opened fire immediately. They did not attempt to surrender. They did not negotiate. Their orders were simple and had probably been standing for years. Buy the boss time. Buy him enough time to run. In the gunfight that erupted in those mountain pre-dawn hours, the firing was intense from both sides. CJNG fighters deployed grenade launchers and heavy machine guns against the incoming special forces. Several government soldiers were wounded in the initial exchange. The helicopters above took fire, but the perimeter held, and El Mencho ran. He made it into the trees, the thick pine forest that surrounded the ranch, and for a short, desperate period, he was gone. A ghost again, disappearing into darkness, into his element, into the terrain that had protected him for so many years. But this time was different. This time there were eyes in the sky that darkness couldn't hide from. Thermal imaging, aerial surveillance, the footsteps of a man moving through forest at night, leaving a heat signature that no amount of tradecraft can erase. They found him among the trees. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere, was on the ground. He had been struck by multiple bullets. Two of his bodyguards, the last two still standing, still beside him, even as the perimeter closed, were with him, also wounded, also finished. He was alive, barely, but alive. The decision was made immediately at the highest levels of the Mexican military. Get him to a hospital. Get him stabilized. Keep him breathing long enough to stand trial in Mexico and eventually in the United States. This was the dream. Not just to kill El Mencho, but to prosecute him. To put him in a box in a Colorado Supermax and let the world watch as the empire he built was dismantled from the inside. Piece by piece, just as they had done with El Chapo, an emergency air transport was organized. Medical personnel were waiting. The helicopter lifted off from the mountains of Talpa, carrying the most significant prisoner Mexico had ever captured. Somewhere over Jalisco, still in the air, still miles from the hospital, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes died. He was 59 years old. The reign of El Mencho was over. The news traveled fast. In the criminal world, it always does. And the CJNG's response was immediate, coordinated, and overwhelming, a testament to just how deeply the organization had planned for this exact moment. Within hours of El Mencho's death becoming known inside the organization, the cartel activated what security analysts later called a scorched earth protocol. The logic was simple and brutal. If the government thought it had won, the CJNG would demonstrate, viscerally and immediately, that winning a battle was not the same as winning a war. Over 85 narco blockades were erected within the first 12 hours, a staggering logistical achievement that required pre-positioned vehicles, pre-mobilized manpower, and pre-arranged communication across 20 different states simultaneously. These weren't just roadblocks, they were declarations, stolen trucks and buses set on fire and wedged across highways, trapping tens of thousands of civilians and completely paralyzing commercial movement in multiple regions. In Guadalajara, the cartel's home territory, the situation was most severe. The city went into a kind of informal lockdown. Businesses shuttered, streets emptied. The airport processed its last few flights before operations were suspended indefinitely. In the neighborhoods of Zapopan and Tlacope, gunfire was audible through the night. The prison assault in Puerto Vallarta was among the most brazen acts. A combined force attacked the facility from outside while a group of cartel-affiliated inmates conducted a simultaneous internal uprising. Guards were overwhelmed. Doors were breached. An unknown number of inmates escaped into the city, some of them mid-level CJNG operatives who had been awaiting trial. Pharmacies were looted and burned, not for product, but for terror. The message the CJNG was sending was not about resources. It was about reach. We are everywhere. We can touch everything. Your government killed our leader, and now we will make you pay for it in the currency of chaos. The Mexican government's response was the largest domestic military mobilization in recent memory. Over 10,000 troops were deployed across the affected states within 72 hours. The National Guard flooded urban centers. Armored military convoys rolled through burning streets. Roadblocks were cleared, sometimes at gunpoint, sometimes through firefights that left casualties on both sides. The death toll from the reaction violence in those first brutal days following El Mencho's death ran into the dozens. National Guard officers killed in ambushes. Suspected cartel members shot during confrontations. Civilians caught in the crossfire. The hospitals in Guadalajara and several other cities were overwhelmed. For one terrible week, Mexico teetered on the edge of something that felt less like a law enforcement crisis and more like an insurgency. Slowly, painfully slowly, the military presence restored a fragile order. The blockades were cleared. The fires were extinguished. The streets returned to a kind of cautious normalcy. But the scars remained. And the deeper question, the one that had been present since the moment El Mencho took his last breath, had not been answered. What happens now? History has a pattern, and it is not kind to those who believe that removing a criminal leader ends a criminal organization. When Pablo Escobar was killed in December 1993, the Colombian government celebrated. What followed was not the end of cocaine trafficking. It was the rise of the Cali cartel, the Norte del Valle cartel, and eventually the FARC as a major trafficking force. A fragmentation that actually made the problem harder to manage, not easier. When Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was finally captured and extradited to the United States in 2017, Mexican officials and American politicians made victory speeches. What followed was not the decline of the Sinaloa cartel. It was an internal war for succession, the splintering of factions, and critically, the accelerating rise of the CJNG, which exploited the resulting chaos to expand its territory at an unprecedented rate. Now in 2026, history is preparing to repeat itself, in reverse. The CJNG without El Mencho is not the end of the CJNG. It is the beginning of the CJNG's most dangerous and unpredictable chapter. Because the fundamental challenge of criminal succession is this. El Mencho held his empire together not through trust, but through personal authority. His word was final. His decisions were unquestioned. His paranoia kept potential rivals in check because nobody was quite sure who El Mencho was watching, who he trusted, and who was about to disappear for becoming too ambitious. That fear, the fear of the man himself, was the cartel's most important structural element. With the man gone, the fear is gone too. And into that vacuum rushes ambition. There are several figures who immediately become relevant in the post-Mencho CJNG landscape. The most obvious successors, El Mencho's biological heirs, have already been neutralized. His son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, was captured and extradited to the United States years ago, where he faces federal drug trafficking charges. His daughter, Jessica Johanna Oseguera Gonzalez, was also arrested and prosecuted by American authorities. The cartel's internal logic of dynastic succession has been deliberately dismantled by targeted law enforcement action on both sides of the border. This leaves the field open to the lieutenants, and there are several worth watching very closely. The first is Hugo Gonzalo Mendola Gaitan, known by the alias El Sapo. El Sapo built his reputation inside the CJNG, not as a strategist or a businessman, but as an enforcer, a specialist in violence so extreme that even within a cartel known for its brutality, he was considered exceptional. He is believed to have personally orchestrated several of the worst massacres attributed to the CJNG, including attacks on civilian populations in contested territories. His claim to succession rests entirely on fear. He is the candidate of pure terror. The second is Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, known as LZ3, El Mencho's stepson, and the commander of the CJNG's elite assault forces. Unlike El Sapo, LZ3 has both a family connection to the founding leadership and operational military credentials. He commands the most trained and most heavily armed units in the organization. His claim to succession rests on loyalty, the personal loyalty of the men who fight for him, and the institutional loyalty of those who see in him a continuity with the man they serve. These two men represent fundamentally incompatible visions of what the CJNG should be. El Sapo sees the cartel as a weapon, a tool of pure power to be wielded against anyone who stands in the way. LZ3 sees it as an institution, a criminal enterprise that requires management, strategy, and long-term thinking to survive. The question of which vision prevails will determine whether the CJNG survives as a unified organization or collapses into warring factions that devastate the communities unlucky enough to sit on the boundaries between them. Security analysts are not optimistic. A consensus among those who have studied the CJNG most closely is that a full internal war is not just possible, it is probable. The cartel's explosive growth over the past decade has created a vast territorial empire with dozens of regional commanders, each of whom has their own army, their own revenue streams, and their own ambitions. El Mencho held all of that together through a combination of personal authority, strategic violence, and the existential threat he posed to anyone who tried to break away. Without him, the centrifugal forces that his presence was suppressing will be free to pull the organization apart. The Mexican government knows this. American intelligence knows this. And in a horrible, perverse way, it represents both an opportunity and a nightmare. An opportunity because fractured criminal organizations are easier to target than unified ones. A nightmare because the violence of a succession war will fall not on government, troops, or law enforcement agents, but on the civilian populations of the territories being contested. The people of Jalisco, the people of Michoacan, the people of Veracruz, the people of Guerrero, the people who had no say in any of this, who had spent years living under the shadow of an empire they couldn't vote against or petition or escape. Those are the people who will pay the price for the war that is coming. There is a temptation in moments like this to declare victory, to say that the system worked, that the years of investment, intelligence, sharing, pressure, and sacrifice produced the result they were designed to produce. El Mencho is dead. The most wanted man in the hemisphere is gone. The temptation should be resisted. El Mencho's death is significant. It is symbolically enormous. It demonstrates that no criminal, regardless of how powerful, how wealthy, how carefully insulated, is ultimately beyond the reach of coordinated law enforcement. That matters. It matters for deterrence, for morale, and for the families of the thousands of people who died because of the CJNG's violence over the past 2 decades. But the structural conditions that produced El Mencho, that allowed someone like him to construct an empire like the CJNG, those conditions are unchanged. Mexico still has systemic corruption that reaches into every level of government and law enforcement. The economic conditions in rural Michoacan, Jalisco, and Guerrero that pushed a young man from La Coayana toward the drug trade in 1985 are, by most measures, worse today than they were then. The demand for fentanyl, methamphetamine, and other synthetic drugs in the United States remains immense, a demand driven by poverty, despair, inadequate mental health infrastructure, and a pharmaceutical industry that spent decades building an opioid dependency into the American population before abandoning the patients it addicted. The CJNG's fentanyl supply chain does not disappear because El Mencho is dead. The precursor chemicals are still being manufactured in China. The laboratories in Sinaloa and Jalisco are still operating. The smuggling corridors, both physical and human, are still in place. The distribution networks that put pills on street corners from Los Angeles to Boston are still functional. What changes is the management. And management changes are always painful, always temporary, and always resolved, one way or another. For the United States, the calculation is complicated. The American government invested enormous resources in the hunt for El Mencho, and there will be political pressure to characterize his death as a victory. But the $15 million bounty was originally intended to facilitate his capture and extradition, not his death. The Americans wanted El Mencho alive in a courtroom, where the dismantling of his financial networks and the prosecution of his associates could continue for years. A dead El Mencho cannot testify. A dead El Mencho cannot provide intelligence. A dead El Mencho cannot, in the language of American prosecutors, cooperate. That is a significant loss, even within a victory. For the Mexican government, the political dynamics are different but equally complex. President after president had promised the Mexican people that the cartels would be brought under control. The capture or killing of a figure like El Mencho was supposed to represent the fulfillment of that promise. But if the weeks following his death produce a surge of internal cartel violence that costs more civilian lives than El Mencho's organization killed in any comparable period, the political narrative becomes much harder to sustain. The war on drugs, if it can even be called that anymore, given how thoroughly that framing has been discredited, has been producing headlines about major victories for 50 years. El Chapo, the Arellano Felix brothers, the Gulf Cartel's leadership, the Zetas. In every case, the headline was followed by a period of chaos, restructuring, and eventual reconstitution of criminal power. The headline changes. The supply chain doesn't. El Mencho understood this. He built his empire knowing that the men before him had fallen, and he structured the CJNG to survive his own absence as much as any human organization can be structured to survive the loss of its founder. The question of whether he succeeded, whether the institution he built is strong enough to outlast the man who built it, will be answered in the months and years to come. Written in violence on the streets and in the mountains of Mexico, history will record Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes as a monster. That is not wrong. The crimes committed by the organization he led, the massacres, the disappearances, the corrupted officials, the thousands of families destroyed, the hundreds of thousands of Americans killed by the drugs his cartel produced, constitute a record of human suffering that is almost incomprehensible in its scale. But history is complicated, and to understand how someone like El Mencho becomes possible, you have to look at the world that produced him, not to excuse it, but to understand it. Because until the conditions that produce El Menchos are addressed, the cycle does not end, it only rotates. He was born poor in a state that has been poor for generations. He was deported from a country that wanted his labor, but not his presence. He returned to a country where a deported felon could get hired as a police officer, which tells you something essential about the state of institutions. He found a criminal organization at the moment it needed someone with his exact combination of discipline, intelligence, and ruthlessness. And he built something that outlived every adversary, every rival, every government initiative designed to stop it. That story is not unique to Mexico. It is not unique to the drug trade. It is the story of what happens when institutions fail, economies fail, and opportunity exists only at the margins, in the spaces between legality and illegality, between survival and ruin. El Mencho spent decades as a ghost because the system he operated within gave him every reason to disappear and every tool to do it. The corruption he exploited was not his invention. He just used it more effectively than anyone before him. His death closes one chapter. It does not close the book. February 22, 2026 will be remembered as a historic day in the long, brutal, and unfinished history of Mexico's war against organized crime. The ghost was found. The trap was set. The most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere bled out in a helicopter over the mountains where he had ruled for decades. But ask yourself this: in the weeks, months, and years to come, when the succession war erupts in Jalisco, when the fentanyl keeps coming across the border, when the next El Mencho emerges from the poverty and the chaos and the institutional failure, will it feel like a victory? That's the question Mexico is sitting with tonight. That's the question the United States should be sitting with too. The ghost is gone, but the machine he built is still running. And somewhere in those mountains, someone is already deciding who gets to run it next. Hit subscribe if you're here for stories that go beneath the headlines, because the headline tells you what happened. We're going to tell you why.